I'm going to give you a little information about me and about the TQ Center. But first I wanted to show you, if you have an internet connection and an iPad or even a smartphone, you can get my slides right now by going to my website, which is laurengo.com. That's a tough one. And Publications and Presentations page has all of the TQ Center publications and other work that I've done. But down at the bottom, you'll see my presentations. And the last one is always the one I'm at now. So here we have the one that I'll be doing today. So if you want to download a copy now, you can do that. And that way, if you can't see in the back, it shouldn't be an issue. And that is my grandson. Is he cute or what? Everybody thinks their grandchild is the cutest, but mine truly is. He just turned 1. Okay, so where was I? Here we are. All right, from the beginning. Now, I'm here today to talk about the tested subjects. And nobody much wants to talk about that these days because everybody is much more worried about the non-tested subjects and grades. And they think, oh, we don't have to worry about the tested subjects and grades. Well, I'm here to tell you that they should be worried. And I'm going to make you all worry. Because I'm going to talk about the complexity of using standardized tests as a measure of teacher quality. And I'm going to talk about the research around that. Because there's quite a lot of research coming out from very smart people that I think we need to be paying attention to in thinking about where we're going with using tests for teacher evaluation. So I'm a former teacher, as most of you know. I taught in Mississippi, in Tunica, for 3 years. I taught special ed there. And I taught language arts, general education in Memphis, Tennessee for another few years. And then I went on to Berkeley, where I did a doctorate in policy, organizations, measurement, and evaluation. There I studied economics of education, I studied statistics, I studied measurement and psychometrics. So I have a grounding in sort of a lot of different stuff, but my real love is policy and working with states like you. And my time right now is mostly spent with the Comprehensive Center, the National Comprehensive Center. I do work for ETS, but I don't get much time at ETS these days because most of my time is actually bought out by the center. And as you know, ETS is a company that makes tests, lots and lots of them. But I'm here to tell you that as someone who understands the testing of students, I can talk to you quite a bit about the limitations of testing. I'm not here to push tests or sell tests. On the contrary, I'm here to talk about limitations of tests for the purposes that we are talking about today. So I think tests are absolutely fabulous for measuring a specific, fairly narrow set of knowledge and skills in a specific subject at a specific point in time. I am more concerned about using that information as a measure of teacher quality because they have never been validated for that purpose. So at ETS we have an entire hallway that does nothing but validity. That's all they do is validity studies on tests. So, 50 or so people that do validity studies all the time. And what they would tell you if they were here is, we validate the test for the purpose for which it was intended. And nobody, no testing company out there has validated student tests for the purpose of measuring teachers yet. So until that happens, I'm always going to have some reservations. But I'm going to talk more about the research and what it is showing about some other concerns that we might want to look at as we move forward in using tested subjects. See if I can put this away and use my pointer here. Okay, so the National Comprehensive Center, it's part of the Comprehensive Center. It's federally funded, partnership of Vanderbilt, Learning Point, which is now an affiliate of AIR, and Educational Testing Service. So we do a lot of technical assistance with states and provide you with information that can be helpful to you, we hope, as you move forward in these very complex times. I also wanted to introduce a colleague of mine, Keitha. Would you stand, please? Keitha Biggers. She also works at ETS, and she is working with me on the TQ Center work. In fact, we have a publication, which if I ever get back to it, we might be able to finish, that will be coming out soon about using teacher evaluation for professional development and growth. And so we will be finishing that up, but Keitha is here to get to know all of you and to learn more about what your interests and concerns are. So I like to frame any set of slides that I'm using with this, and that is that the goal of all teacher evaluation ultimately needs to be to improve student learning, improve teaching so that it can improve student learning. And if it is not in the service of that goal, then we're going to have no change. So you may use teacher evaluation to identify ineffective teachers, but they still are going to be ineffective. If we're not using evaluation in smart ways to actually inform our professional growth opportunities, then we're going to be just spinning our wheels. We may be able to identify the ineffective ones, but we're not going to be able to help them get better. And you know, the entire system is not designed to actually get rid of teachers. And even if it were, you can't fire your way to success. And especially in many of the isolated rural areas that exist in some of your states where they can't get teachers. If you fire your social studies teacher, you'll never get another one. You know, so the idea of firing our way to success is simply not going to be successful for most of our states. So some trends in teacher evaluation. Policy's way ahead of the research. Boy, is it. We just don't have. You know, I was talking to Louisiana this morning and they were saying, so who's doing this well? Nobody. And there's no research on it either. We are so new at this that right now there's a lot of ideas and a lot of, you know, let's try this or let's try that. But what we don't have is evidence to base decisions on. So when people say, well, how should I weight this? You know, what's the right combination of weighting? How much value added and how much school-wide and how much this? And there is no research on any of this in terms of what is the right combination of measures, what is the right model to use. It just doesn't exist yet. So we're just way ahead of ourselves in that sense. So all of this is a big experiment. Now the inclusion of student achievement growth data is a huge culture shift, particularly for teachers. It scares the heck out of many of them, and rightfully so, because they are on the front lines working with the kids every day, and they see the many things that contribute to those kids' ability to learn at high levels. They see kids staying home because they have to take care of their little brother because their mom's off trying to find a job. They have days where they come to school hungry because they don't have enough food to eat in the house. They have days when they are sick, they haven't been to a dentist in a year. So there are all these conditions and factors that kids bring to school with them that the teachers have no control over. And so when they say, there's only so much I can do, then you know they feel like they shouldn't be held solely responsible for those test scores. So there's a lot of communication that needs to happen with teachers around how we're going to do this and what it means to them. The implementation challenges are just enormous. Few models exist. I mean, if there are good models out there, I would tell you. The most complex model, and the one you're actually going to hear about in the upcoming webinar from Colorado, from Olka Hansen, she was actually my recommendation for the webinar because they have a model that's this thick. I mean, if you want to find language on teacher evaluation, on the non-tested subjects, on the tested subjects, if you want diagrams, go to the Colorado website. Just Google Colorado teacher evaluation and you will find tons of great stuff. Now, I'm not saying they've got it right. They're still in the pilot stage. But what I'm saying is, if you want to see what somebody else is doing in great detail, it's a place to look. So how did we get here? How did we get from the point of it's all observations all the time to now we're doing student achievement? And I blame two types of studies, not necessarily these exact studies always, but there are two types of studies. So Rick Hanyashek, the second author on that first one, you saw him yesterday in the film. He's an economist at Stanford. He's a good guy. His heart's in the right place. He's a friend. I love Rick, but he's misguided in some ways. And one of those ways is this. Some of the work that he's done is really, really good and useful at showing that teachers are different. So in this Texas study, what they showed was they took a lot of data and said teachers are very different at getting student achievement results. So student growth in one classroom is much higher than student growth in a classroom, even in the same building, much less between schools. So it's not like there are certain schools where all the good teachers are. Even within the same building, there's more variability among teachers in their ability to get student achievement growth than there are across the district, which I think is a really interesting finding. And so does everybody else, which is why it got so much attention. So there are a number of studies that have documented the same sort of thing. We know that teachers are differently effective in terms of their ability to get student achievement growth. So, starting with that point, everybody said, oh, well, why aren't we using that to actually determine who's your good teacher and who's not? Then we have the widget effect report. And by the way, all of these references, there are lots of references in the slideshow, are available at the end of the slideshow. So if you go on my website, you can actually click on the links to all these references. So you don't have to busily write them down because they're all there for you. So the widget effect report basically said, you know what? All teachers are good or great. 90% of them are good or great. And the study was done in 6 districts where kids are failing at high levels, where they are not achieving proficiency, where they are not making the learning goals and objectives that we hope for them. So how can you say that all of your teachers are fabulous if the kids can't read? So that was the big dilemma. All of a sudden people said observations are useless in terms of helping us differentiate among our most and least effective teachers. And we have value added that is great at differentiating. But what Rick Hanushek would tell you if he was here, and he says it in the paper, we don't know why those differences exist. They cannot tell you how much of those differences is the teacher and how much are things like the peers, the resources, the leadership in that school, etc. So there's a lot of things that we don't, and the randomization effect, exactly what was described in the film yesterday. Your newest teachers often get your hardest kids to teach. Happens everywhere. There's research that documents it. So we don't know how much of it is the teacher effect. That's part of the problem with value added. So race to the top, we've talked about these, effective teacher, 1 grade level, etc. So the focus on value added is looking at that change. And the multiple measures of teacher effectiveness, I'm not going to go through this other than to say that the idea of laying these out into categories of evidence is to say there are multiple ways that we can collect evidence on a teacher and get that whole enchilada and not just the tiny piece of it where we have no idea what the thing is. So the evidence of growth in student learning and competency, that's what we're going to focus on in this next few slides. First, I want to talk a little about growth versus proficiency, because I want to make the case that value added is a good thing, and then I'm going to make the case that value added is a scary thing. But first, let me talk about the good part. The good part is proficiency model focuses on, and this is the NCLB model, your school has to achieve a certain proficiency, all your kids have to be reading at this level. As we know, most schools are never going to hit that. So the proficiency model is sort of been replaced, especially in Race to the Top and in other federal priorities, with this idea of a growth model rather than proficiency. But what I want to point out here is that teacher A in this slide has a proficiency level, whoops, sorry, a little carried away there, has a proficiency level that looks good. So she's achieving success. So she looks like a good teacher in a proficiency model. Teacher B, her kids are starting much lower, but she's also making growth, but her kids aren't hitting proficiency. So in a proficiency system, teacher B would fail. Teacher A would succeed. And that is the problem, because teacher A is teaching in a school where the kids are advantaged, they come in knowing more, so it's much easier for them to achieve those higher levels. Whereas teacher B is starting in a more difficult and challenging school with kids who are further behind. Now, many people would say teacher B is probably actually better because she's getting the same growth out of kids who have summer learning loss, who have a lot of challenges. So she's working harder and smarter to get that same growth. So that's a possible interpretation too. But now the next slide here, teacher A's kids are starting even higher, but they're making less growth than teacher B's kids, who are starting even lower. But look at the difference in the slope. Now, who's a better teacher? Teacher B. That's why we love growth models, because they recognize growth It does not matter that you're teaching the kids that are the lowest level in terms of coming to you. What you are tasked with is to show growth, not to get them to proficiency when that may not be possible. When I was a teacher in Tennessee, I taught 7th grade English Language Arts. My kids came in reading at the 3rd and 4th grade level. There was no way I was going to get them all to proficiency. So the idea is we're not going to try to get them all to proficiency in an impossible task. But we are going to show growth and try to make high levels of growth, that 1.5 year growth that nobody quite knows what it means. But that's the goal, is to help these kids catch up. So in this model, we like growth. We are more interested in showing growth, and that's why the Race to the Top and other programs have focused on that. Now, value-added models, many of you know about TVOS. That's Sanders' original model. He now has a national version of that called EVOS. And it typically uses 3+ years of prior test scores, although there are models that use considerably less than 3 years of data. But let me tell you sort of the basic way to understand value-added. You have a kid who has some test scores. You use those test scores to make a prediction, statistically, about his next test score. Now you have a whole room full of these kids, each of whom has their own prediction. A teacher with high value-added has kids who, on the average, are achieving higher than predicted on those tests when she has them. A teacher with low value added, the kids are achieving less than predicted. So that's a simple way to understand value added and what it does. There's a lot of variation, though, in these models, and that's what we're going to talk about, is some of the research on these. So here's a description of value added that I thought was sort of a helpful way of describing it. Not quite the simplicity that I use, but it's pretty good. There are various methods for estimating teacher value added, but all typically entail some variant of subtracting the achievement test scores of a teacher's students at the beginning of the year from their scores at the end of the year. Now that would be sort of a true pre-post model. What we're doing instead is using test scores from a previous year and a previous teacher and subtracting that, which is somewhat different, and I think that I much prefer the idea that we could actually test at the beginning and the end of the year. And making statistical adjustments to account for differences in student learning that might result from student background or school-wide factors outside the teacher's control. So what all of the value-added models do is try to account for differences among kids. So we know that there's a strong correlation between lower test scores and poverty. So it tries to take into account of those things in the value-added model. So we like that. Now, evidence of contribution to student learning growth. I'm just going to go through a bunch of research slides, and like I said, you can go and look at all these research studies yourself. But this is the positive, the we love value-added slide. Value-added can provide useful evidence of teachers' contribution to student growth. We like that. We want to know, are the kids in 8th grade math learning the appropriate math that they should be learning? So we get a value-added score that may help us to know, yes, the kids in that class are achieving at high levels, higher than expected, or they're achieving less than expected. It is not a perfect system of measurement, but it can complement observational measures, parent feedback, and personal reflections on teaching far better than any available alternative. Now the interesting thing here, Glazerman and colleagues who wrote this are very pro-value added, but even they temper the conversation by saying it should not be all by itself. It should be combined with other information that you can get on teachers. Now let's talk about some of the scary stuff. All right, stability of scores. This is probably one of the biggest issues that we should be worried about in using value added. Any practical application of value added measures should make use of confidence intervals, and what that means is for any given teacher, you have error, and error is the part that you're just not sure about. The smaller the number of kids that are used to calculate value added, the bigger the error. So you can get much better calculations with much smaller error at high school or even middle school where they have, 120, 130, 150 kids. If you have an elementary school teacher with 20 kids and 3 of them don't have test scores, you have a huge margin of error because you're basing that teacher's score on 17 kids. So that error needs to be thought about in the decisions you make based on that information. Is this something with a small error or a big error? And what does that mean in terms of the decisions we're making about the teacher? Should include multiple years of value-added data in combination with other sources of information to increase reliability and validity. So the idea is it shouldn't be used alone, we know that, and also multiple years of data. And we're going to talk more about that coming up. The scariest one of all, I think, is the type 1 and 2 error rates one. And what this means, I'll just read it and then I'll tell you what it means in sort of lay terms. Type 1 and 2 error rates for comparing a teacher's performance to the average are likely to be about 25% with 3 years of data and 35% with 1 year of data. What these error rates mean is a teacher who really is not good is said to be good. That's an error. Or a teacher who is really good looks bad. That's the other type of error. So with those errors, what this study said is with 1 year of data, you get 35%. So that means 1 in 3 teacher is misidentified as good when they're not or bad when they're not. Now, even with 3 years of data, 1 in 4 teachers is misidentified as good when they're not, bad when they're not. See the problem there? So we have to decide what is our willingness to put a lot of reliance on a measure where we know that the identification of these teachers is not going to necessarily be accurate every year. So, but this definitely makes a case for wanting to use multiple years of data. So instead of having 1 year of data for a teacher and basing a teacher's score that year on 1 year value added, you would use a rolling average, which means that the previous 2 years and this year, the average of that would be the teacher's value added score, because then you would get something a little closer to what is the true score. More of this, Codal and Betts suggest using multiple years of data to mitigate the bias. Problem is novice teachers can't be evaluated. If you are insisting on, I need a minimum of 2 or 3 years of data, you can't use the first year of data for your novice teachers. So that would be a problem. McCaffrey et al., there are significant gains in the stability of teachers' value-added scores using a 2-year average performance measure rather than a single year. So there is a preponderance of research that says multiple years of value-added data rather than a single year is much more likely to get you valid results. So this one is focusing on the statistical model. Teacher effectiveness scores for a teacher can vary considerably across statistical models. What this means is if you're using EVAS, which is Sanders' model, Tennessee, or if you're using Mathematica's model, or if you're using AIR's model, or if you're using VARC's model, there are all these different models, you may get somewhat different results. Now what that tells you is there is no single magic thing that you can say, this gives me the perfect understanding of teachers. What it says is, we have a model, we know it's flawed, because they give you different results. If all the models gave you the same score for the teacher, great, but they don't. And what that suggests is that the teacher score is somewhat dependent on whichever one of these value-added models you're using. Now, scores may vary by content skills tested. I think this is really important stuff. If this school did, and they did a study of a large district, they don't ever name the district. If this school district were to use procedure scores to evaluate its middle school mathematics teachers, it would come to conclusions that were substantially different than evaluations based on problem-solving scores. What they did here was they took a single test, and this particular test had 2 components, subscales they call them. One was focused on procedures. Can the kid add and subtract? Do they know their tables? You know, can they do all the sort of procedural things that math requires? The other scale on this particular test focused on problem solving. These are those horrible word problems, like if the train leaves the station at 5 o'clock and it's going, you know, those kind of things. What they found was huge differences between teachers' value added based on those 2 things. So even within the same test, if you look at different scales, what you're going to see is that some teachers were much better with the procedural stuff. Guess what? Test prep, than they were with the problem-solving stuff. There were some teachers who were really good with the problem-solving stuff, which suggests a much more intensive project-based or thoughtful way of teaching math, which isn't, I'm not dissing procedures, I'm just saying that that's important also. And what we were seeing with this study is that there are differences. So some teachers were really helping the kids with the problem solving, other teachers not so much. And it's not based on the kids. This has nothing to do with having, oh, well, these kids come in ready, these kids come in smarter, these kids come in more privileged. No, it has to do with the teacher in this case. So the study shows that even subscales of the same test by the same test developer, this is one test, can yield different results, as can different weighting among subscales in a composite score. So let's say the state had contracted with this test maker and said, we value the problem solving more than we value the procedural part. So we want you to weight that higher for us when you do the test calculations for us. If they had done that, you would get different results than if they said, we value procedures and we want you to weight that higher. See the problem? So the content of the test can also matter in terms of your value-added results. And more from this same author, our results provide a clear example that caution is needed when interpreting estimated teacher effects because there's a potential for teacher performance to depend on skills that are measured. So what the teacher is focusing her time on, and guess what? If I know my value-added score is going to be based largely on procedural stuff, I'm going to be focusing on their math, their multiplication tables. I'm not going to be doing the word problems if I know that that's mostly what's going to be on the test. So precision of scores is the next issue. Any practical application of value-added measures should make use of confidence intervals in order to avoid false precision and should include multiple years of value-added data. So this just has to do with the preciseness of what we get if we focus on doing this well. And this is a conversation you have to have with the people who are doing your value-added, if that's what you're doing. And by the way, you Colorado growth model folks, I will get to you. But the issue here is still an issue of error. We know that there are errors involved here, and we have to take account of those. Now, roster accuracy. This is a huge issue. Let me tell you, when I taught in Tennessee, I taught in Memphis in a very, the worst performing middle school in the state, I think. And in Tennessee, in Memphis, kids were allowed to pick their own schools, basically. If there was room in the school, you could go to that school, even if it wasn't in your immediate neighborhood. And so our school was the only school that ever had any room because nobody wanted to come there. So the schools that wanted to get rid of kids because there were behavioral problems or whatever kind of problems they were, sent them to us because we were the only school that had room. We were half empty most of the time. We had lots of empty classrooms because nobody wanted to send their kids to that school. So that was the challenge that I had. It was very high poverty, high gang area. One of the reasons I got hired there so quickly is because there had been a shooting in the hallway the year before, and a lot of the teachers quit over that. But even after that, the turnover rate at my school was 50% of teachers turned over. And interestingly, in both Memphis and in Tunica, where I taught in Mississippi, I was made the team captain and the special ed captain my second year in both cases, only because I was the one who came back. Not because I was such a great team leader, but I actually came back. So we know that in value added, it's important to make sure that you're crediting the students and the teacher appropriately. So I had a roll of kids. I had huge classes, 35, 40 kids in my classes. So I had a very large roster. But most of my kids did not come to the first 3 classes because they came at lunch. We actually did not take attendance until lunchtime because the kids didn't show up and we wanted the maximum ADA, right? So we didn't bother with attendance until lunchtime. So many of the kids that I was credited with for my value added, I seldom saw because they were in my first few periods. So you see the problem there? I did not have an opportunity to verify that those kids were in my room at those times. So how can I teach them and how can I be measured and held accountable for their test scores if they weren't actually in my classroom? That's why rostering is important. The teacher should verify everyone who is in her classroom. And this is something that they're finding in the Gates study. One of the biggest issues they found when they started to do the value-added work for that study Was the teachers, they asked the teachers to check the rosters. Did you actually teach these kids? And they'd say, yeah, I never saw that one. Or I had that one for a month. So there are all these issues with the roster. So that's why we're worrying about that. So to have confidence in the result, we must know that the teachers are accurately matched. This is complicated in situations where more than one teacher taught a student in a given year, which is surprisingly common. And in fact, Hawk and Eisenberg, these are the folks that are doing the work in DC, they're doing value added for Washington, DC's impact, found that 21% of the teachers in one large urban district, which is Washington, DC, had students who had also been in another teacher's class. 21%, 1 in 5 of your students had more than one math teacher in a given year. So talk about complications in rostering and talk about an opportunity to make big mistakes. That's the issue. They examined various scenarios for getting the most accurate results using value added. I encourage you to share this with your value added person at your state, because I think it's important for them to look at this, because what they did was said, here's the best way to do it if you've got multiple teachers for a particular kid. So they actually have a model in there that they've demonstrated is the best one. So studies currently underway have shown considerable errors when teachers are asked to verify that they taught particular students. Teachers should be given an opportunity to verify, and the school should verify the number of days a student was in school. And there needs to be a set of rules around that, like how many days a kid has to be in the teacher's room in order for them to be even counted. Student effects. We like to say that value added takes care of most student effects, but not all. And this is one of the research pieces that demonstrates that. A teacher who teaches less advantaged students in a given course or year typically receives lower effectiveness ratings than the same teacher teaching more advantaged students in a different course or year. Here's what this means. They took teachers who had multiple years of data. So in some of those years, they taught less advantaged students and more advantaged students. Or they took teachers who had multiple courses. And in some, they may be teaching the high track kids, and in others, they may be teaching the lower track kids. And they did a comparison, and they said, uh-oh, we're not taking care of all these effects. Because what they found, in fact, was when they are teaching those less advantaged kids, they're actually getting lower effectiveness scores. Does that mean that they, as a teacher, are less effective? Not overall, but maybe with kids who are coming in who are struggling, who have gaps in their knowledge and understanding, maybe they are less effective with those. But the point is, who a teacher teaches makes a difference in their value-added score. So don't let the value-added people say, it makes no difference. This study shows that it does, and that's of concern because when teachers know that, they're like, I'm not teaching those kids. So we have to make clear that we are going to take that into account in some way in our system. So models that fail to take student demographics into account further disadvantage teachers serving numbers of low-income, limited English proficient, or lower track kids. Student characteristics can impact teacher rankings, sometimes dramatically, even when such characteristics have been controlled for. So even if you're putting controls in for advantage and disadvantage and all of that, there is still this residual effect of teaching these lower track kids. So, more on student effects. Models using different controls for student characteristics do not substantially change results in spite of huge variation in those characteristics. Now, this is the good news, is in this particular study, they said, you know what? Even when, in this study, they had a variation of from 0 to 100% pre-lunch, and from 3 to 80% African American. So some of the demographic information that they used in the study, wide differences among who these teachers were teaching in terms of the demographics of the kids. So this is showing that many of the models, in fact, virtually every model they tried, there was a bunch of different models in the study, came up with about the same results. There was not a huge variation. So in that sense, for the piece of it that can be controlled by value added, the models are doing a good job of that. But there is a piece of it that cannot be controlled according to the other study. And by the way, all of these studies, these are the best people in the country. These are RAND, Mathematica, all of the big names in doing research are the ones that I'm highlighting here. Now, we're off value added for a moment, and we will have time for questions, by the way, but we're going to talk about the Colorado growth model because there's at least one state that is using that. Problem is I have no research on this. And the reason is because there is no research on it, because it's never been used for teacher evaluation purposes. With value added, we have a 20-plus year history in Tennessee of using value added, tons of research on it based on that Tennessee data, and now tons of research based on other data. Colorado growth model has never been used for teacher evaluation purposes, so there's no research on it. It was actually designed to be used more in a formative way, a descriptive way, to help schools better understand how they were doing, how their teachers were performing compared to other similar teachers in schools. So that was the original intention, but now it's been, like everything else, co-opted for teacher evaluation. So all of these things that were designed for other purposes are being sort of shifted into a new purpose. So it focuses on growth to proficiency. It does not use students' prior tests to make a prediction. What it does is after the kid takes a test, it uses the entire universe of the kids who took that test, and it says, how did this kid do compared to them? And so, but it comes up with the same sort of results in terms of teachers, because what you do then is say, here is a classroom where most of the kids in this classroom, on average, are doing better than their academic peers. And here's a classroom where they're doing worse than their academic peers. So taking those two things into account, you get the same thing. What you get is a ranking of who are your teachers who are doing well and who are your teachers who are not getting good results. This is an example of the Colorado Growth Model Report, and this was shared by Damien Biedebender, who is the one who is doing all of this work. It's his model, his design, and I think the number of states who are using it are now up into the teens, so it's become quite the competitor with value added. But I love this report because it really illustrates nicely what you're doing here. So if I can make my pointer work, we'll see. Okay. This gray shading area, on the left it says advanced, proficient, part proficient, unsatisfactory. The gray shading are the academic peers scores. Now, one of the very sad things you'll note, but also very typical in large urban areas, this is Denver data, by the way. You have a made-up kid, but you have real data here. Grade 3, grade 4, grade 5, grade 6, and next year. Notice how in grade 3, you have a lot more kids in proficient and quite a few in advanced. Grade 4, your numbers of unsatisfactory start piling up, and these start getting narrower. Grade 5, increasingly narrow. Grade 6, look how many advanced and proficient you're losing every year. This is very typical of urban schools. Every year after well, even up until third grade, kids do okay. After third grade, and the researchers say it's reading comprehension. If the kids don't get the reading comprehension, by third grade they're doomed. But it could be other factors as well. Anyway, so we have this kid, and he's starting right here in grade 3 at just the borderline of unsatisfactory and part proficient. He's moving up. He's all the way into proficient now. That's good, so he's got some good teaching. He's continuing to move up, and here he is just on the borderline of proficient. And if you see this fan shape here, this is high and typical and low. So what this shows is that for this kid, he can go in this direction for the next year. And so what this is useful for is the teacher can have a conversation with the parents and with the kid. Say, look what you've done. Here's how you compare to all the other kids who took this test. And here's where you're going to go next year. And it really is good at illustrating for the parents and the kids where they are compared to other kids. And that's one thing I really like about the Colorado Growth Model is it compares you to the academic peers and thus uses that information for teachers. Now, like I said, there's no research on it, so I can't list all of the problems with it that I listed for value added. So you're kind of left wondering about that one. So what they can and can't tell you, they're really measuring classroom effects, either Colorado or value added. You cannot sort out the teacher and the teacher's practices, instructional role, all of those things from all of the other things that impact student achievement and learning in a school or in a classroom. You just can't do it. And so that's why we need other measures. because this one is not enough. They can't tell you why a particular teacher's students are scoring higher than expected. Maybe the teacher's focusing instruction on test content. Maybe the teacher's offering a rich, engaging curriculum that fosters deep student learning. So my question is, which of those classrooms do you want your kid in? Not the test prep, right? So it matters how they're getting those results. It's not enough to be able to say, oh, that's an effective teacher. I want to know more about how they got those results, and that's why we need other measures besides value added. So validity, there is little research-based support for the validity of using any measures, including student growth measures for teacher evaluation. We just don't have the data yet. So when people ask me who's doing it right, we don't know yet. Herman et al. State validity is a matter of degree. This was that lovely chart that Lynn showed you yesterday, the if-then chart that is so frightening because you can't get past 2 in most places. Validity is a matter of degree, based on the extent to which an evidence-based argument justifies the use of an assessment for a specific purpose. So we have to keep in mind with all of the measures, including value added, are we justified in using this? And if so, what are the ways we can do to make sure it's used in ways that are fair to the teacher and that give us the best results in terms of validity? It doesn't mean you don't use the measure. It means you use it with the appropriate cautions. So it starts with defining the criteria and standards you want to measure. Requires judgment about whether the instruments and processes are giving accurate, helpful information. And you verify validity by comparing results on multiple measures, multiple time points, multiple raters. So what you want to do is surround the teacher with evidence of various types that can be used to make a judgment. So this is the New Haven matrix. I was talking with one of the groups about this. It's really interesting because what its purpose is to say, here's something wrong. And in this case, what's wrong is this asterisk here. Because what you've got here is you've got student learning growth at the top. So this is your value added score, let's say. You've got instructional practice, which is your Charlotte Danielson or whatever model you're using for that. And professional values, which might be contribution to school things. And so you combine those scores in this matrix, and what you will see here for this 3, you have a teacher who is getting fabulous learning growth, but who looks terrible in the observation. Pretty much the only way you can get a 1 in an observation is to be doing nothing. I mean, you have to be sitting in the back of the room while your class goes wild in order to get a 1 on an observation. This is fiery material to get a 1. So we got a 1 here, but we've got fabulous test results. There's something horribly wrong. Here's a teacher who's not teaching. The kids are getting great tests. So one of 2 things is happening. The teacher is cheating like hell. We know it happens. Sorry, we know it. But it's rare. Or the teacher is so good that at the beginning of the year they created this wonderful learning environment where they activated kids as resources for each other, where they introduced kids to various resources and computers, and they have a lab, and they have all these great things for kids to do, and the kids are basically teaching themselves now, so the teacher can sit in the back and read the paper. That's also possible, but it's unlikely. Same thing down here with this asterisk. We have a similar problem here. This is somebody who looks fabulous in the observation. You walk in and you think, my God, that's the best teacher I've ever seen. But her test scores are flat. She's getting not only no growth, but they're going backwards from their predicted scores. Something is horribly wrong there as well. This may be an example of a teacher who puts all their effort into making that 1 star appearance in front of the observer and shows videos the rest of the year or whatever. But the idea is comparing the results from measures should help you to validate the measures. And when you're seeing differences that don't make sense, like these right here, that's where you want to say there's something wrong and we need to look into that.